Today, Freedom Central is talking to the South African writer Linda Smith in her hometown of Durban. Linda, it's an absolute honor and a pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you for giving me your time. And I really want to speak to you about the work you're doing and the journey that you're currently on, and how you came to be on this journey communicating this message.
Well, Mel, it's very interesting. I was born in South Africa. I have very little recall of that life, but when I was about 3 or 4 years old, I remember travelling by steam train up into Africa. We went over the spray of the Victoria Falls Bridge and on towards the Congo, and the train stopped at a town called Mufulira, which is the second largest town in now Zambia, then Northern Rhodesia. And that's where I grew up. My father had left South Africa 9 months earlier to go and work on the copper mine there. So I had the privilege of growing up in the Federation of Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. I grew up in the real Africa, the raw, the wild, the beautiful Africa, the Africa romanced by people dreaming about adventure. That Africa was a very beautiful and peaceful place. We knew no fear, even though we had lions walking into the town and, you know, there were wild animals all over. It was absolutely fantastic. We enjoyed wonderful freedom living up there. Unfortunately, on Sunday, the 11th of July, 1960, which also happened to be my 9th birthday and the Rhodes and Founders holiday, the violence that was brewing in the Belgian Congo after the Congolese had gained their independence from the Belgian Congo on the 30th of June. That day, 11th of July, broke out into full-scale war. And it was the most traumatic and horrendous day of my life. The refugees flew across, well, in their cars, came across the border in their thousands. The cars were sprayed with bullets, smeared with blood, and they were literally bumper to bumper. They fled with whatever they could grab and put in their cars. Some fled with nothing. Some fled without their wives and their children. Some children were left behind in the most horrendous savage slaughter you could ever imagine. Fortunately for them, some of the miners from Mufulira and Nkana mines got in their own cars and drove into the Congo. They drove into all of that to go and collect the people who had been left behind. And that has left such an indelible impression on me, that people would do that. Where we lived in Mufulira was a mere 10 miles from the Congo border. So the whole onslaught of that hit our town. After that, life was still fantastic. Things still carried on nicely, but things were certainly changing. In 1960, the British Prime Minister, Sir Harold Macmillan, came to South Africa and gave his Wind of Change speech. And that started a storm in southern and central Africa. And nothing was the same again anymore. Britain had promised in writing and verbally that the Federation, the last outposts of the British Empire, would never be split up. Britain blatantly lied, she cheated, her behavior was just disgusting. And in December 1963, the Federation was split up. In July 1964, Nyasaland became Malawi, and under the dictatorship of Dr. Hastings Banda, they lived a very difficult life, the rural people, after that. I've got to tell you, to the rural people, to the African people of Central Africa, politics meant absolutely nothing. When they were asked, what are your views on politics, they would say things like, Mina haikona hazi, mina funa bicycle. I don't know, I want a bicycle. And these poor people were not left alone. They were manipulated, they were tortured at night. The knives and the sticks came out and they were beaten into submission. They were told when they asked questions, but we don't know anything about the money and the wealth of the country. How are we going to manage that? And they were told, no, people overseas will just give you lots of money, and everything's going to be served to you on a platter. Life is going to be great. Anyway, on United Nations Day, may I point out, 24th of October, 1964, Northern Rhodesia, which was the second wealthiest country in Africa, was given independence from Britain, and under the rule of Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, who was a school teacher, was brought to ruin and brought to its knees in no time at all. The country was bankrupt, the people were starving. The white people left in mass because of the murders, which is similar to what is going on in South Africa. Southern Rhodesia became known as Rhodesia, and under the leadership of Ian Smith, who did absolutely everything to get all the people of Rhodesia working together. He had all the tribal chiefs in his parliament, all the headmen, everyone had a voice in his government. But Britain would not acknowledge the legitimate leaders of the African people. She would only acknowledge the terrorists, the ones that she had placed in, So this orchestrated a war. During the 10-year Bush War, which was the most hectic, grueling, terrible war you could ever imagine, 20,000 people lost their lives. The fighting continued until there was a manipulation to move Robert Mugabe into to head up the country. I think it was in 1983. He sent his North Korean trained 5th Brigade troops into opposition tribal areas and had over 40,000 people slaughtered. Over 40,000 African people slaughtered. And once again, we waited for Britain's condemnation, and we were deafened by the silence. I began to realize that nothing we heard on the news was true. From little, I sensed that. And I had an aversion to newspapers. I never read newspapers because I don't believe 99% of what is in them. I had this intuitive sense that it wasn't true, and I always wondered, how could I ever find the truth of what was really going on? Anyway, because of all this, I moved to South Africa, and it's been great. I love the country, I love the people, but it's not the same. And there isn't a day in my life when I don't want to go home to my country and live the peaceful life that I lived.
Yeah, for sure. And this has obviously had a huge emotional impact on you, and it's quite destabilizing for the millions of people around the world who have suffered the same fate as yourself.
It's the same story, different place. Different names, same speeches.
Do you know who it was that was in charge of Robert Mugabe? Because it's not Robert Mugabe who's actually the ultimate control of Zimbabwe. Who are the people behind him?
Probably Britain and the United Nations and America. Britain, the United Nations and America were directly involved with the Congo War. With the direct cause of it, the United Nations went in to keep the peace, and they caused more violence and more hardship than had been otherwise. Yes, we understand savages in the Congo were doing horrendous things, but so were the United Nations troops. They were shooting at innocent people in peasant carts. They were slow to give assistance. They caused problems in Elizabethville. They literally bombed Elizabethville to pieces because they were not going to allow the province of Katanga, which had previously been an independent province, to break away from the Congo. It's now 50 years later. That war started in 1960. It's now 2010. That war hasn't stopped, not for 1 minute.
And in your opinion, Linda, what is the reason for these wars?
Well, they are making people of the world disassociated from the countries they belong in. Eventually, everybody's living in a place that doesn't really mean anything to them. And when the troops come down and do things to that country, nobody shouts. At the end of the day, it's about control. People might be saying, yes, they're making millions from weapons and armaments, and yes, they are. I mean, at one stage, 30,000 tons of ammunition was being brought into the Congo every day. But it's beyond the money. It's about control.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've obviously written a wonderful book, which I've read, Returning to Myself, which beautifully ties in your own history as well as your hope and message for humanity.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about how you came to be communicating the message that you are communicating, as well as your introduction to David Icke.
Well, as I mentioned, I never believed what the reporters said, and I always wondered how one could find the truth. And then in 1997, I heard David speaking on a video called Robots Rebellion, and it hit me like a lightning bolt. I thought, wow, here's a man who has found the truth. He's found a way to get behind the scenes of everything. And to my amazement and surprise, and as the universe works things out, a couple of months later, he came to South Africa, and I was involved with the organization of that, and he stayed with me, and that was the beginning of our association, the association with David and myself. And then in May 2005, he came to South Africa on a research mission, and some things happened which led to Dr. Krida Mutwa, the great Sangoma, the High Sanusi, throwing the bones for me. Now, those bones were given to him by King Mwanawina Lewanika of Barotsi land, Northern Rhodesia, Zambia, where I come from. You know, I felt like these are my bones, and I was absolutely amazed at, you know, what they revealed. And one of the things was that I had to tell the world the truth about those old countries, and I was to teach the people of the world, you know, the other things that I had learned, the wisdom, the spiritual wisdom, etc. And I was specifically to pass it on to the younger people, which is, yes, in that book and my further writings now, is what I'm attempting to do. And I do think that the world is now ready for this information, because you've surely got to have both your eyes poked out if you can't see what is happening in the world.
In your sort of humble opinion, what do you give us a sort of summary of what your worldview is and how it relates to us here in South Africa?
It certainly seems to me that South Africa is a repeat of the rest of Africa. The speeches that I've heard here, I've heard the same speeches up in Central Africa. The same things have been happening. If we take Zimbabwe, for instance, Zimbabwe was quickly made a gun-free society. No citizens of Zimbabwe may own a firearm at all. Therefore, these people have no way of defending themselves against the government forces. So when the government forces come down on you, there's nothing that you can do to help yourself. They're now trying to make South Africa a gun-free society, and a lot of restriction and control is put on legal gun owners, but nothing is done about the criminals. It seems to me that crime is allowed to happen in this country, simply that the criminals are now the unpaid soldiers doing the government's work. It seems they are on agenda, and they are being told what to do by elsewhere. And again, I would look at America, Britain, and the United Nations, who I think are holding hands with supposed communist, socialist countries, all being the same place at the end of the day. And I think in the name of democracy, this country is being marched to socialism or communism. I think that the wealth of the country is being taken away from the people and put in government coffers. They are now talking about nationalizing mines, certain businesses as well, and in the end the people end up with nothing and the state has everything. Well, that doesn't sound like democracy to me. A lot of monopolies are allowed. Any kind of opposition can't survive the monopolies. So at the moment, things aren't looking very good. But the change, the transformation of the world is coming from Africa, and specifically from South Africa. There are a lot of amazing people who are very aware of what is going on, and in our own way we are quietly doing what needs to be done. We don't need separation, we don't need to be divided and conquered, but with all the cultures and all the races that we have in this country, we need to hold hands together and together move forward. And we need to get rid of politics in government. We need a government that looks after all the people fairly and equally, not the elite club that keep the government in place. We all have a voice and we're all important.
On the elite club that keep the government in place, most South Africans are thoroughly unaware that there is something behind the government. When I say to people that standing in line to vote is a waste of time because no matter who gets into power, the power structure wins. Do you feel that there is still a higher oligarchy or a controlling cabal who tell the South African government what to do and what policies to implement?
I have no doubt of it, because, you know, when you travel around, what is being pounced on us here is being integrated in other countries around the world. We are no isolated case. It doesn't matter where you go or who you speak to. It's the same story. So there's definitely a plan to march the world into a one world government. I would like to have the world dance towards a no government. Advanced civilizations don't need governments. We don't need the strong arm of the law telling us what to do, when to do it, and how to do it if we conduct ourselves properly and correctly. I think that the fall of the governments rests entirely in the hands of the people in the street.
Absolutely. What do you suggest then that people do, in their own small way, to make a difference?
Well, I would first say is to never ever give your power away. Never allow anybody else to think for you. Don't give your power to religion, to politics, to cults, to philosophies. When you give your power away, you have no power. When you give your power to a religion or whatever, you actually become that thing. My advice is to step away from anything that involves fear, that involves control. I think we must follow our hearts and do what our hearts tell us to do, because then we can become the magnificent people that we really are. We are not these low-down, snivelling things that religions and governments tell us we are. We are mighty creations. We are divine. We are all that is. And all that is doesn't need a government telling us what to do. We are meant to live magnificent lives. And when we get all these structures out of the way, we will live magnificent lives.
Do you have any personal gifts or abilities that you'd like to tell people about that we can all access and harness?
You know, the answer to that individually lies within ourselves. But there's certainly some things that we can do that will change our lives unbelievably. One is to have gratitude for absolutely everything that happens in our lives. And sometimes we suffer in order to learn a lesson. That makes that suffering worthwhile. If we learn the lesson, we don't need to suffer again. Another thing is to have intent. Every day when you get up, let us just intend what our day is going to be. We don't need all sorts of things to protect us from our fears. If our intention for the day is that we're going to be safe, and we're going to get around and do everything that we're meant to do that day, that is what will happen. I think we need to communicate with our divine self, the great self, and the more we bring that to the fore, the more our lives will become great and we'll be able to do whatever we're meant to do. We all have talents and abilities, and we don't realize what these are until we start working at them and knowing what they are. I didn't know that I could write. So to be told that I had to write was the biggest shock of my life. But actually, I can write. And I'm discovering I can do all sorts of things. And the cause of a lot of our problems is lack of self-esteem. Society teaches us that, our parents teach us, education, the governments. But when we take our power back, there's no stopping us. We can perform miracles. We can be the transformation that the world needs. It's up to us. And most of all, absolutely love yourself utterly and completely, because in love is all our power. Stop being unconscious, wake up and look what is happening around you. Think deeply and don't just act without knowing what you're really doing.
I tend to find, having come from Europe, where people are starting to wake up to all this information, people are a lot more open to it, that people here seem to be encrusted in a horrific layer of fear. South Africa is a country that's dominated by fear, and because of that fear, they can't see the woods for the trees. I'd just like to know your opinion on that and how we go about shifting this vibration of fear that's around us.
Yes, that is the case. South Africa is encased in fear. The crime rate in this country is the worst in the world. Because of the lenient jurisdiction, very few of those crimes are actually brought to book. So people are very fearful. We're having hijackings, we're having all sorts of things. The only thing really is to just perhaps stop looking at the news, stop reading the newspapers, surround yourself with friends who don't speak about these kind of things, and to read uplifting information. Find out what's really happening in the world, and literally, when you have no fear in you, it doesn't affect you. If you're driving around the road and you're full of fear, you're going to get hijacked. But if you just literally have no fear and are totally conscious, you can't be fully conscious and have fear in you at the same time. So literally step out of the fear, surround yourself in love and consciousness, and you're going to be absolutely fine and absolutely safe. We're going to have an absolutely fantastic, bright future here.
Well, I'm so pleased to hear you so optimistic, because I am ever the optimist, and I too, like you, believe that the revolution of the world is coming from Africa. I don't know how I know this, I just feel it, and I want to know how you see the future of South Africa panning out.
I see a government that is not politically motivated, and beyond that I see no government. I see the people standing and working together and helping each other. We have a fantastic profusion of cultures in this country, and when we on the ground can resolve all our differences and learn to get on with each other, we will walk the world into a brighter future. I don't think there's anywhere in the world that has the complications that South Africa has. They can't even begin to imagine what life is like here. Unfortunately, we are always criticized by the world, and that is simply because the news, the media, put out information about South Africa that is not true, it is not correct, and that's happened throughout the whole of Africa. I mean, I could tell you stories that are absolutely ludicrous of what the media have put out there. So I put all that aside, and South Africa has a phenomenal future.
At the moment, there seems to be this real rise in religious cults. We've got the Mighty Men Conference, which happened up the North Coast over the weekend, where all men got together. I think there was over 500,000 men got together with this guy who's written a book called Faith Like Potatoes. And there's this Rhema church run by this Ray McCauley, who himself is an absolute contradiction in what he preaches. Why is it that people are so easily suckered into religion here?
I think it's because people are so in fear and are needing answers. So I do have a sympathy with these people. They do find some kind of nurturing in this. But it's not something that lasts. You know, sooner or later you've got to open your eyes and look around. If religion is helping to make you a better person, that is fine. But if it's taking your power away from you, then I don't think it is so good. If people simply take their power back and realize the answer lies only within themselves, they don't need to go to seek it in religions or politics or cults. But I do understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about your book. You said that you were told by Freedom Centralvia to write this book.
Yes.
And it's wonderfully inspiring. I mean, it's the material about the war and the history is very saddening, of course, as a South African. It's sad to see this happening in such an amazing continent. I mean, we are the wealthiest country in the world, just in terms of our resources, yet we have so much problems. And I'm wondering if there isn't a connection between all these, the fact that we have so much crime, but yet we are in resources the wealthiest country, and how come so much of the money is not staying here?
Well, I don't think it's even staying on the planet, quite honestly. That is something that if people are interested, they could certainly research that. And yes, I know it gets mouths hanging wide open, but I think there's interest in this country, not because of the wealth of the people and the manpower, but simply the resources, which is a great tragedy. I think the earth needs to keep her resources to herself. And I think that once we're fully conscious and living as higher beings, we don't need money. We won't need any of those things. We won't have to continue destroying the earth by raping her of her riches. I think they're in the earth for a reason, and that's where they should stay. I think once, you know what happened in Zambia? The mines were nationalized, and everything was just chaos. Everything just fell to pieces. And the people who were in place then, the mines, the wealth, put money into the rural areas. We built things up. We really, really did a lot for the African people. And even in the Congo, I mean, I've listed what was done for them. But in those countries now, people from overseas are in there and they're mining, and they are doing nothing for those countries. They're raping those countries and taking all the wealth out, and they're putting nothing back. And I think that is happening in South Africa as well. People are getting poorer. The condition of the country is getting worse. All these social services are collapsing. That's not a very good reflection for an incredibly wealthy country.
Now on to the jaw-dropping stuff, Linda. Tell us about your opinion as to what's happening with the off-world situation. Do we have extraterrestrials coming here and taking the wealth of our planet?
I'm absolutely sure we do have. There are a lot of underground bases in Central and Southern Africa. The Great Zimbabwe Monument is one such place. Freedom Centralvia himself has been abducted in the parking there. There are snake-like people who live in rocked-up places in the Umtali area in Yanga mountain range, and you can only see them by flying over in a light aircraft. I myself saw a spaceship in the late 50s when I was traveling through southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. And there have been quite a few sightings in Zimbabwe at schools where the school children have seen spaceships land and beings, you know, get off the planes, off the spaceships rather. Apparently from the Storms River mouth in the Eastern Cape to the Great Zimbabwe Monument, there's a fourth dimensional passageway. Now, the Storms River mouth is in a nature reserve area where access is restricted. And if you go in there, it has such an eerie feeling. And if you go to the Great Zimbabwe Monument, which was apparently built by the Nubians, it has that same eerie feeling. But it is not an eerie, scary feeling. It's actually a very elevated feeling where you really feel, wow, it's so fantastic to be here. Yeah, there's a lot of sightings seen on the south coast and the north coast of South Africa. We can't all be seeing nothing. We can't all be imagining these things. I have absolutely no doubt that there are extraterrestrials everywhere. And if you look at David Icke's DVD with Freedom Centralvia, the reptilian agenda, a lot is revealed in there. And there's such a wealth of information about all of this stuff that, people must open their eyes and have a look, and they'll understand what's really happening.
Why does he think that the mainstream newspapers aren't cottoning onto this kind of information? Surely it would make front page news, and why is it not coming into the fore if so many people are seeing it and more people are becoming aware of it?
I think the newspapers help to ridicule anything like this, and I think very few people even bother to report it to the newspapers because they know they're going to get ridiculed. I think they're trying to suppress the information. They don't want us to know this. And when we ask why would that be the case, we've got to look at who owns the newspapers. And when we see who owns the newspapers, we just put another piece of the jigsaw puzzle together.
Yeah. This is the reality, unfortunately. South African society, although still relatively wild in much respects, is under an immense control of fear. We control each other with fear of what other people think here, very much so. Yes. And I'm finding this coming home. How do you perceive we go about bringing people into awareness of things that would otherwise seem ridiculous?
That's a very interesting one. I'm always telling people all these weird things, and I know my friends think that I'm a little bit crazy, but never mind, I love them anyway and we're close. I had a wonderful situation where a friend of mine was listening to these lizard stories and thinking I was crazy until she saw one herself.
Where did she see it?
She saw, it was a few years ago, she saw it on television. Her mind couldn't compute. It took her mind a few minutes to realize what she'd seen. And when I told the story to someone else, they said they'd also seen it. They couldn't understand what they'd seen. A few years ago, with the coronation, I think it was the 50th coronation of the Queen in Buckingham Palace, they were having a big do on there. And the commentator on the TV said, "Oh, and here comes Margaret Thatcher." And in walked Mr. Thatcher next to a long, tall green lizard. And she was like, "What's that?" And then it was such a flash for such a quick second that she didn't understand what she'd seen. But after 5 minutes, she realized what she had seen and she'd phoned me. So thank goodness I had told her about it, that she understood what she'd seen. And a few days later, I told someone else about this, and they never said a thing, but they came back the next day and said, "I've been thinking about what you were saying. I was watching that on television, that whole procession, and there was a procession in the garden, and at the very back of the procession was a tall green lizard was walking. So we've got to assume that was Margaret Thatcher shape-shifting into a long, tall green lizard." So, when people do mock me, and so I do understand. It's bizarre. I do understand that people cannot accept that. But those are the people who get to see it. So, then they understand, because now the boot is on the other foot, and it's up to them to go and tell other people that they've just seen something really, really strange.
Well, I'm a big believer that the reptilian race it's real. I've seen someone shapeshift as well in media, very high ranking when I was working in television in London, which I'll tell you about afterwards. But for me, what's quite interesting is to see, having done the research, how many people from extreme situations. You've got the ultimate extreme, which is Dr. Credo Mutwa, talking about the Chituri, okay, and he's a rural African Sanusi, and then you've got people like David Icke from the other side of the world who are talking about these things. People like Patricia Corey, who's a scribe to the Syrian High Council, and she's being told they exist by the people she communicates with through her channeling works. So when you put all these pieces together and you start seeing these people who actually, they're not crazy. I've met them. They're very together. They're wonderful, loving people who care for humanity. They're not out to make a quick buck out of this, because all it does is discredit them in public view. We actually have to realize that there is something happening that we don't know about.
Yes.
And I guess what I want to do is get to a point where people understand that there's more to this world than what they're told.
Yes.
And to stop trusting everything they read in the media and the newspapers. What would be your advice to those people?
Think for yourself. All the unanswered questions that are fobbed off, they've got to have answers. And if the normal regular status quo can't give an acceptable answer, then the answers have got to be somewhere else. I think that if we could just go back to what we once were, because I think we were far greater, higher beings before, but the system has brought us down, down, down to become small, littler, more miserable. I think if we can go back to what we really are, then I think we'll find the answers to all these questions. But, just have an open mind.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about any stories you know about potential extraterrestrial sightings here in South Africa. Do you know of anybody or anything else that we could put in?
Somewhere past Hillcrest, I've never been there myself, but apparently there have been a lot of spaceships landing there, and I think they even built a hangar there for that. And we can perhaps get hold of those people and bring them into this. I'm sure I can track them down. There was also the amazing situation with Elizabeth Clara in the late 50s, just up here in the Midlands, in Natal, in the Drakensberg, back of the Dragon, who was visited by Arkan from the planet Meton, a very advanced civilization that don't have governments. And there was an amazing connection between Elizabeth Clara and Arkan. And in fact, she had a baby with him and went to Meton and spent a little bit of time there with him before coming back to planet Earth. And he has amazing, wonderful things to teach us. And I think if we step ourselves up, we too can hopefully at some stage go and live on planets like that. I certainly don't want to come back into a situation where I've got to get indoctrinated, from age 6 to 18 and, all of that to teach me how to be a pawn in the system. I want to live a much higher life than that. And we're all capable of doing that.
Absolutely. Do you know if Elizabeth Clara's child is still alive?
He is still alive. He's living in Pinetown, but unfortunately he's found religion and he's very anti all of this and in absolute denial.
So I take it Arkan was humanoid.
Arkan was a humanoid, yes.
Pretty much a template for this galaxy. I mean, there's humans out there in different civilizations. Yes. From what I've been told from my contacts,
yes,
that they're pretty much human out there.
Yes.
Where are there any other underground bases in South Africa that we know of or have heard of through various sources? Are you aware of any other underground bases?
I'm not aware of any others in South Africa. I just know there's a lot of activity along the coastal line and in the Drakensberg. And apparently there's quite a lot in the Karoo as well. It's wonderful if you go to the Karoo. I was there in January. There are so many stars and so many shooting stars, and it's a vast expanse of land that is barely inhabited. So that's a wonderful place for extraterrestrials to move around and have activity.
Interesting. I've still got this intense feeling, and I can't. I'm still waiting for the tangible clues to come to me. But it's a very deep and profound feeling. With the discovery of some of these ruins, I just keep thinking that there's a much bigger agenda in terms of the extraterrestrial agenda with regards to South Africa that we haven't quite got yet. We're not quite aware of it, and I don't know what it is.
Yes, I would agree with you. I can't tell you that I've laid my finger on it yet. I think it's far stronger in Zimbabwe, southern Rhodesia. That's a reptilian breeding hive up there. Huge reptilian breeding hive up there. And it's amazing because the place has such an incredible vibration, and it might be that vibration that they need to breed.
Do you think that reptilian base there is one of the oldest in the world, because they came to Africa first?
I would definitely say so. It certainly seems to be. I'm not really au fait with the situation in the rest of the world, but I think it's pretty ancient. And in Africa, you have the Tokolos and all those things that the African people believe in. And you can't have so many different people believing in absolute nonsense. When people lived in villages, all separated, to all have experienced the same thing.
And in Zimbabwe, a theory I have long held to, and it is my opinion, that one of the reasons why Zimbabwe is kept in such an utter state of despair is because of this reptilian base, so that people don't discover it by becoming too civilized there.
I think that is correct. You know, I'm not very pro-civilization for Africa. I mean, it sounds crazy, but I do think that people should have the privilege of living their natural, normal life, because that's who they really are. And education really just brings people into the system. And I've got to say, does Africa really need to be brought into the system? Because the more it's brought into the system, the more chaotic it becomes. The beautiful, peaceful rural Africa that I grew up in wasn't contaminated with too much civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a wonderful country here, and it's really sad to see all these things happening to it. And we've recently had the assassination of Eugene Blanche, which I wholeheartedly believe is a problem-reaction solution.
Yes, I absolutely that was done to get something going, and I think it was a set-up job. Credo Mutwa, when I phoned him and told him, he said, "Oh my God, I predicted that. I predicted that the great eagle will be plucked from the sky and feathers would fall." And the great South African seer, Sina van Rensburg, had also predicted that.
So this is something that's part of the agenda.
It's part of the agenda.
Part of something to come, and I hate to be a pessimist about it, but I think it's part of creating more conflict.
Yes, fortunately there is a way out of this. When we transform, don't change, but transform and become fully conscious, we just step out of the program. An alchemist friend of mine is at the moment working on all these programs, working on the programs that are being projected from the base at the back of the moon, working on all of these things, and they are being destroyed because he works on them in the metaphysical world. And if we work on ourselves in the metaphysical world, we put a stop to all of this, and it's going to be like waking up from a nightmare. It's going to be over.
Yeah. Talking about the moon, I recently received a copy of David Icke's new book, which mind-blowing, and yes, it's a big leap when you read the back and you go, oh my God, David's really blown his credibility this time. But as you get through this information, you realize, hang on, I knew that. My God, he's so brave to come out.
Yes.
And he says, in my opinion, that we're being controlled from the moon. And you know, I've known all these little factions dropped in, but I've never strung them together. And that is the talent.
Yes, absolutely. He certainly does know how to connect the dots. Yes, we are being controlled by the back of the moon and that back end of the moon, and that was picked up metaphysically from here. And those programs are going to be destroyed, and they're not going to affect us anymore. Then we're going to be freeing them. And once you're free of these things, you just feel absolutely fantastic because you know you're out of the system. And when you're out of the system, there's no way that anyone's going to get you back into it again.
Well, I'm at that point now. I've stepped out the matrix completely, but what I'm struggling with is, unfortunately, in this third dimensional reality, we're still reliant on having to put a roof over our heads, which costs money, which is controlled by the system, and that, unfortunately, is, you know, when I say to people, step out the matrix, they go, yes, but I still have a house to pay for.
Yes.
You know, how would you sort of quantify that to people?
You know, it's a matter of becoming fully conscious. When we're fully conscious, we don't have needs anymore. And anything that we require will be provided by the universe. Our gratitude. You know, I remember Carolyn Mace telling a story about a woman who was running through America, I think it was. And she had nothing but her little shorts, a t-shirt and her shoes. And it was chilly and it was getting dark. And the voice in her head said, go under the bridge. And she didn't argue, she went under the bridge. And under the bridge, there was a box and a blanket. She had something to keep her warm and a place to sleep for the night. There's nothing stopping us providing our own houses, providing everything we need by simply getting in the flow and doing what our innate intelligence tells us to do. And these things will be provided.
That is wonderfully reassuring, because I think we need to get people to the point where they have enough faith. What would your ultimate message for humanity be?
To become the ultimate divine human, and we all have that within us to become that. And it might sound like a tall order, but just to be the best person that you can be in every moment of your existence. And if we all did that, we would transform the earth to heaven on earth in a heartbeat.
I've been told by people who I communicate with that the biggest polluter on this planet is negative thought, and it's quite simply changing the way we look at the world, and we can change the world around us.
Yes. Unfortunately, we've got truth, and then all the rest, everything else is perception. And if we can put all our perceptions aside and look at the world as it really is, absolutely magnificent. Look at the divine in every human being. Communicate with that person's God self. And if we do that, we'll change everything.
Linda Smith, thank you very much for your time today. It's an honor and a privilege to share these moments with you, and I look forward to doing it again.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.